Good evening, everyone. I've got a few minutes after 6, and we've got a big night tonight, busy night, so we want to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here this evening. My name is Lee Sawyer, and I'm one of the co-chairs with the PAC process. I'd like to also introduce our other co-chairs, Stacy Parks, Bill Hedge, and Lois. Again, we want to thank you for being here tonight. We've got a really important night. This is a meeting where we begin to summarize all the work we have been doing over the last year plus through the PAC process. We have two major items we need to accomplish tonight. First, we'll hear from Dr. Franklin Hill and Mr. Sam Johnson. They'll present a draft of a St. Joseph School District Facilities Master Plan. Second, we will work in our small groups to provide feedback regarding the plan, and we will provide feedback regarding draft statements of recommendations that we would be taking to the Board of Education at the conclusion of the PAC process. Now, just a reminder, a goal of our program right from the beginning was to make sure people from across our district got to know each other by working together in the small group work activities, and doing so works towards broadening our perspectives and enriching our program. Thank you for that. Tonight we wanted to randomly assign people to tables for work on the important tasks ahead of us. We appreciate your cooperation. This will make for a better experience for everyone. And because of the amount of work we have for tonight, we have scheduled our meeting to run a half an hour longer than normal. So the meeting could go until 8:30. So we appreciate your being with us till 8:30 tonight, potentially. Okay, many of you know the routine. On each table is a sign-in sheet. If you have not already done so, please pass that sheet to everyone at your table. We want to make sure and get your information on that sheet. Okay. Just a reminder that all the documents from each of our sessions is available on our official PACT website, which is www.pact4sjsd.com. And also you can go to the district website and click on the PACT logo and it'll take you to the same site. Okay, now before we hear the details of a facility master plan, we wanted to give you some reference information about how school districts typically fund capital improvements. And we appreciate tonight we've got Mr. Todd Goffey, who's the managing director for the firm of Piper Jaffray, being available to provide this information to us tonight. Now this will be very brief, and let me repeat, this is just for reference information. This information may be valuable at some point in the future. Now during all of our presenters tonight, you may have some questions that come up, and so what we'd ask you to do is let the presenters get through their portion of the program. Then, during the small group work activity, if you do have questions, a number of us will be circulating around the room and hopefully to be able to answer any questions that you have. Okay, now if you, at this time, please join me in welcome Mr. Goffey.
Good evening. Thank you for having me here tonight. As Lee indicated, what we'd like to do is just take about 10 minutes to provide a very high-level overview of the ways that school districts finance capital improvements in Missouri. Basically, there are two ways that is done, and that's through the issuance of general obligation bonds or the use of lease purchase financing, which takes on a couple of different names, either certificates of participation or leasehold revenue bonds. And I think as we go through this, it's important to realize that this is not tied to any specific plan or any concept that you might hear later on tonight. It's just simply a reference point. We're trying to provide you with a framework from which you can have a basic understanding, and certainly any action items on capital financing will occur at a much later point in time. As I mentioned, the two different ways to finance those improvements are general obligation bonds or leasehold revenue bonds, but GO bonds is what we generally call general obligation bonds. It's just GO bonds for short. And far and away, that's the most widely used method of finance in Missouri, is to vote general obligation bonds. That's a full faith and credit of the school district, and what that means is at the time the bonds are issued, the full faith and credit of the school district stands behind that, and there is a separate debt service fund levy that gets established. It cannot be commingled under law with any other funds of the district. It has to be in a separate and distinct fund, and that debt levy is established at a level that when combined with the assessed valuation of the district is going to generate enough tax dollars to make the principal and interest payments. Certainly one of the, I think the primary reason why we see such a widespread use of GO bonds in Missouri is that it provides the lowest borrowing cost of all the different alternatives. And the reason that is, again, is because it's got the full faith and credit of the school district standing behind it. With that issuance of general obligation bonds, it does require a vote of the people. And it's either a 4/7 or a 2/3 majority requirement depending upon the election date. And so, for example, when you're in an odd-numbered year like we are this year, the only election that's a 4/7 requirement happens in April. If you would use other election dates in an odd-numbered year, that's going to require a 2/3 majority, which many times can be difficult to get. When we get into an even-numbered year, such as 2012, then not only is April a 4/7 election, but August and November would also be possibilities to go and get a 4/7 majority. Any other election date, there are some odd dates that happen sometimes in February or even June, but those dates in any circumstance would be a 2/3 majority requirement. One last thing on general obligation bonds is that under state law, the maximum term on general obligation bonds is 20 years. And so you can certainly do something shorter than 20 years, but by law you cannot exceed 20 years from the date the bonds are issued. With lease purchase financing, voter approval is not required for the lease purchase itself. However, many times what happens is that a district does not have sufficient operating funds available to make that lease purchase payment. So in those instances, many times a district may still need to get voter approval, but in that case, they're seeking voter approval of their operating levy, which can be done by a simple majority. Because the public, the voters are not voting on the bonds themselves, and it's not considered debt under Missouri law, it is subject to an annual appropriation pledge by the Board of Education, and as a result of that, it ends up resulting in higher borrowing costs versus general obligation bonds. The focus of the next few slides really is going to be on general obligation bonds. We can talk more in the future about lease purchase, but I think for purposes of tonight, the discussion really is going to center around the use of general obligation bonds. Again, under Missouri law, general obligation bonds are actually it's a constitutional, Missouri Constitution, it's limited to 15% of a district's assessed valuation. And so this is applicable to any school district throughout the state, that they cannot vote and issue any more than 15% of their assessed valuation. And so on this slide, you can see we've done a sample calculation taking into account the district's 2010 assessed valuation. You do have some bonds that are outstanding, and then you have a balance in that debt service fund. Sometimes you'll hear us talk about that in the terms of Fund 3. That's just simply the debt service fund. But as of today, the remaining